Hello folks, I'm back for part 3, I think, of the Twits, and we are up to the funny walking stick, which is a picture here for you, and we just finished the last chapter with Mr. Twit having eaten spaghetti with worms in it. So, Mr. Twit now wants to get his own back, and to do that, he's going to play with Mrs. Twit's mind. Anyway, let's go. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick down the stairs to his work shed. There, he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, on the bottom of her walking stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small. The next morning, Mrs. Twit didn't even notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny piece of wood. In fact, every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny piece of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly, so the extra bit could look like a part of the old stick, and gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by. But you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly that you can't even notice it from one week to the next. And it was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Miss Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must suddenly have grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How could a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not your stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mrs. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks, that's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. The next chapter is called Mrs. Twit Has the Shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair, and you've shrunk so much that your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night, when he'd gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he'd done the same to the 4 legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there on the same old chair," he cried, "and you shrunk so much that your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit. pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got 'em badly. You've got the most terrible case to the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me," she cried. "Tell me quickly." "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What must I do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. And there's a picture of Mrs. Twit slowly losing it. Ooh, in the right way. She looks a little bit worried there, doesn't she? I'm just going to pause there and have a quick drink. Hold on. This next chapter is called Mrs. Twit Gets a Stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons, and he had fixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring. And he then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, and some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. And soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave like that for a couple of days and nights, just to teach her a lesson. I'm going to show you a picture, because it's a good picture. There you go. And there she is being stretched. In fact, he was just about to leave when Miss Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings are on my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that is what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "Take you to the moon," exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen, would we?" "Oh dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles, quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit. and with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket and with one quick slash, cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In fact, a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last, the old hag is lost forever." And then we're on to another chapter, very quickly. It's called Mrs. Twit Comes Ballooning Down. Oh, sorry, I can get the picture. Everything's opposite. Oh, there she is. Excuse me. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start to come down." And she began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. And each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed. When she'd bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day and there was no wind at all. And because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. And now she began to come down straight. And as she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at the extraordinary old woman in the sky. I'm going to read this last chapter for this afternoon, and this is Mr. Twit Gets a Horrid Shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he'd seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down, and when she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grizzly old grunion! You rotten old turnip! You filthy old frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he's been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer, he looked up, he gasped, he gaped, he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. He said, "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit, and she was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her walking stick when she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll gnash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. I think that is the end of Mr. Twit's revenge. I think this might carry on a little bit. They don't seem to get on very well. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. It is Friday afternoon. I'll try and read some more. We'll carry on during the Easter holidays, so don't worry, we'll get to the end of it soon. I hope you're good, take good care, and I hope you're enjoying it, because I'm enjoying it too. See you later. Bye-bye.